Vivian Cole drove the Bentley Continental into the fifth garage in 3 weeks and received the exact same answer she had gotten from the 4 places before it. The engine's control computer was fried. Replace the whole unit. The total estimate across all 5 quotes had climbed to $243,000. She was standing with a pen in her hand, nearly ready to authorize the work order, when her assistant leaned in and whispered a name. A worn-down garage on the edge of the industrial district, run by a single father almost no one knew existed. No neon sign, no showroom, just motor oil and the sound of metal against metal, and a man named Julian Reyes wiping his hands on a faded rag, looking like someone who had never once needed to impress anyone. Vivian Cole had built Cole Aerorite into the second-largest private aviation services network on the East Coast before she turned 36, and she had done it without apology. She ran meetings the way surgeons ran operating rooms, with precision, economy, and the clear understanding that every second of indecision carried a cost. She did not arrive late. She did not offer unnecessary warmth. She did not spend time on feelings when facts were available, and she had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that people who led with emotion rarely lasted long enough to matter. The company's private fleet moved everything from Gulfstreams to a small collection of vintage road cars Vivian kept as a personal indulgence, the only part of her life she allowed to be sentimental. She had personally selected the Bentley Continental that now sat immovable in her private garage, a $610,000 machine she bought as a gift to mark 15 years of partnership with Desmond Okafor. The car hadn't been merely a gift. It had been a statement, the kind she'd learned from her mother's example, that the Cole name was synonymous with the finest things that moved, and that 15 years of partnership with a man like Okafor deserved something that couldn't be replicated by a wire transfer or a card with a signature. She'd driven 3 different Continentals before settling on the specification, the color, the stitching, the bespoke dash, and had taken satisfaction in knowing the car was exactly right. It had been, until it wasn't. Desmond Okafor was not a man who asked for much. He held 22% of Cole Aerorite's equity, had been her mother's closest ally before her mother's retirement, and had never once raised his voice in a meeting or sent an email in anger. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight other men's speeches never could. And when he'd called to confirm he'd be arriving the following Friday to take a drive in the Continental, the car Vivian had described in her own words as a symbol of everything Cole Aerorite stood for, she'd felt the pressure of that conversation settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The car had died on a Tuesday afternoon. Okafor had been in the passenger seat for a demonstration run along the coast road when the engine cut mid-acceleration, no warning, no stutter, simply stopped, as if a switch had been thrown. The car rolled to a dead stop at the edge of an intersection. Okafor said nothing. He waited for the tow, accepted the ride Vivian arranged, and spoke only once before climbing into the substitute car. He told her he looked forward to seeing the Continental when he returned from Lisbon. His tone wasn't angry. It was something quieter, and Vivian had always found quiet far more difficult to carry than anger. She called her head of fleet operations from the side of the road while the flatbed was still loading the car. The instruction was direct. The car needed to be perfect within 7 days, and he was authorized to spend whatever was required to make that happen. She hadn't imagined, standing on that curb watching the Bentley rise onto the truck, that 7 days would become 3 weeks of compounding silence and 5 very expensive dead ends. She hadn't imagined it because in the world Vivian Cole operated in, problems at sufficient cost could always be solved. The only variable was the number. This time the number kept changing, and the problem kept standing in place, unmoved, immovable, silent. The first call went to the authorized dealership on the north end of the city, the only certified service center within 80 miles. Their lead technician spent 2 full days with the Continental before delivering his conclusion with the calm authority of someone accustomed to delivering expensive news. The engine control module had suffered a catastrophic internal fault. Recommended path: full ECU replacement with updated firmware. Estimated cost: $152,000, with a projected timeline of 5 to 7 weeks pending parts from the crew plant. Vivian authorized a second opinion before the first invoice had even printed. The engine management specialist flown in from a boutique firm in Zurich spent 3 days performing his own diagnostic. His report used different language but arrived at the same place. Internal short in the control unit, consistent with a manufacturing batch defect, requiring full replacement. His quote came in at $191,000, with an 8-week lead time. The third shop was a private facility called Precision Continental Works, a name that had come up twice among Vivian's technical team, and once in a trade publication she'd skimmed on a flight to Chicago. The owner had 35 years of experience with British luxury drivetrains and had personally worked on cars belonging to 2 royal collections. He looked at the Bentley for one afternoon and told Vivian's technical liaison that the module was beyond repair and needed to be sourced directly from the manufacturer. The price, $238,000. He didn't offer a timeline, because he considered the question premature until Vivian confirmed she wanted to proceed. A fourth opinion came from Sovereign Auto Engineering, a competing service network Vivian would normally never have approached. She approached them anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was not something she knew how to do. Their senior technician reviewed the diagnostic data from the first 3 evaluations, spent an afternoon with the vehicle himself, and submitted a report aligning closely with the third shop's findings. Replacement was the only viable path. His quote, $221,000. Vivian stood in her office the afternoon the 5th report arrived, holding the entire stack of assessments in her hand. $243,000. A car that was supposed to be a symbol of the coal standard, sitting unusable in a garage, with 8 days remaining before Desmond Okafor landed at the airport. She hadn't eaten lunch. She'd canceled 2 meetings without rescheduling them, which her assistant would later describe as the single most alarming signal of the entire ordeal. Vivian Cole did not cancel meetings. She sat down slowly in the chair behind her desk, looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below, and thought about her mother, who had built the first coal charter office out of a single leased hangar with 4 employees and a handshake philosophy, who had told her once, when she was still young enough to learn things without resistance. The most expensive mistake a person can make is paying to be wrong with confidence. She'd been too successful for too long to remember that until now. Farah Danso had worked for Vivian for 4 years and had learned in the first 3 months which battles were worth fighting and which were better left to time. She was 30, organized to a degree that bordered on architectural, and possessed a quality rare in Vivian's orbit. She told the truth, even when the truth was unwelcome, because she'd long since calculated that the long-term value of honesty outweighed the short-term discomfort of delivering it. She knocked on Vivian's office door at 4:30 and placed a small folded piece of paper on the desk, without preamble. Vivian looked at it. She looked at Farah. She asked what it was. A name, Farah said, and an address. The paper read, Julian Reyes. Reyes Auto, Foundry Row, Industrial District. Vivian picked it up the way she might pick up a note she expected to find disappointing. Julian Reyes was 37, Farah explained, working through it methodically. He'd been raising his son alone since the boy was 14 months old. His uncle had left him the garage, a 2-bay operation in a part of the city the luxury car world had never thought to notice. No website, no digital footprint, no trade association membership, no professional network Vivian's contacts could verify through normal channels. What he did have, and Farah had spent 2 full days confirming this through sources she considered genuinely reliable, was a career that had ended far too early, and a reputation that traveled only by word of mouth, which in her experience was always the reputation worth trusting, because it required no one to curate it. 2 months earlier, a private collector in Miami had brought Julian a Pagani Huayra that the factory's own authorized service partner had declined to accept for repair, citing irreversible electrical damage from a storm surge. The collector had been quoted $310,000 for a full harness replacement and told to consider the car a total loss. Julian Reyes had taken the car. 9 days later, it was running without fault. The collector paid Julian $8,400 and offered him 12 times that to relocate to Miami with a fully equipped shop provided at no cost. Julian had declined without appearing to consider it very long. Vivian looked up from the paper. Her expression hadn't changed, but the quality of her silence had shifted in a way Farah had learned to recognize over 4 years. I am not taking Desmond Okafor's car to a garage on Foundry Row, she said. Farah placed a second document on the desk, a printed personnel record, partially redacted, from a source she later described only as someone who owed her a favor. The record identified Julian Reyes as a senior powertrain electronics engineer at Halloway Bexley Motorsport in Coventry, England. 9 years of service. Principal engineer on the development of the adaptive engine management system used in the Mark's flagship hypercar. Multiple internal citations for diagnostic innovation. Departure date, voluntary resignation. Reason listed, personal circumstances. Vivian read it twice. She set it beside the first paper and looked at both together on the clean surface of her desk. The clock behind her head read 4:41. She had 8 days. She picked up the phone and handed it to Farah without another word. Farah was already dialing. Julian answered on the third ring with the name of his garage. When Farah explained who was calling and why, there was a pause long enough to make Vivian wonder whether he'd set the phone down. Then he said, "Bring it tomorrow morning, early." And that was all. The garage sat behind a chain-link fence on a stretch of Foundry Row where the sidewalk ended and a rail spur began. The sign above the entrance had once been painted in dark red letters, faded now to a pale suggestion of itself, readable only if you were already looking for it. Vivian arrived at 7:15 in the morning in her rental car, wearing a charcoal suit and heels that had no legitimate business on a gravel lot, and found the gate already open. An old delivery van sat on one of the 2 lifts inside, its underside exposed and attended to. The other lift stood empty, waiting. The bay smelled of oil and solvent, and something beneath both of those, something older and more honest, the smell of work done over a long time in a place that had never once been arranged for the comfort of observers. Julian Reyes was on his back beneath the van. He didn't come out when she parked. He didn't announce himself. She stood beside her car a moment, then walked to the entrance of the bay and said his name with the same measured tone she used in conference rooms. The rolling sound came from beneath the van, and the man stood up in sections, first sitting, then rising, and she found he was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way people become when they work with their hands for 20 years without giving it any particular thought. He had a grease mark along one forearm and another across his jaw, and he looked at her the way someone looks at a weather report, gathering information without assigning emotion to any of it. Seated in a small folding chair near the open bay door was a boy of about 8, wearing a soccer jersey, absorbed in a handheld game, with the total concentration only children bring to things that don't matter to anyone but them. He glanced at Vivian with frank, uncomplicated curiosity, then returned to his screen. Vivian laid out the situation the way she'd practiced it during the drive. The Bentley, the 5 assessments, the quotes, the timeline, Okafor's arrival in 6 days. She used technical language deliberately, the way people do when they want to establish whether the person across from them is fluent or merely familiar. Julian listened with his arms folded and his eyes on a point somewhere past her shoulder. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where's the car?" The flatbed arrived 20 minutes later. Julian walked around the Bentley 3 times after it came off the truck, hands clasped behind his back, not touching anything. Vivian watched him and found the restraint quietly maddening. She was used to technicians who put their hands on things immediately, who needed contact before understanding could begin. Julian didn't appear to need contact. He looked at the car the way someone reads a page before deciding where to begin. He asked 3 questions. Had the vehicle been professionally cleaned before any of the 5 diagnostic visits? Vivian said yes. She'd wanted it presentable. He nodded. Who had been driving when the failure occurred, and for how long? She told him she'd been at the wheel, Okafor in the passenger seat, roughly 8 minutes into the drive. Had any electrical work or aftermarket accessory been installed in the 60 days prior? She pulled the service records up on her phone. A new satellite communication unit had been fitted 5 weeks earlier at the authorized dealership, part of a fleet-wide connectivity upgrade. Julian absorbed this without visible reaction. Vivian broke the silence deliberately. 5 specialists reviewed this vehicle. Each of them concluded the control module is dead and requires replacement. Do you agree with that assessment? He looked at her for the first time since the car had arrived. His eyes were dark and level, holding the specific calm of someone who had stopped needing to prove things a long time ago. Someone for whom the performance of confidence had become unnecessary because the thing itself was sufficient. "I haven't opened it yet," he said. "I don't agree or disagree with people who haven't opened it either." She was still processing that when the boy walked over and stood beside the rear fender of the Bentley, looking up at the long silver hood with the same unhurried seriousness his father carried. "This is a nice one," the boy said to no one in particular. "Dad always says nice cars shouldn't die young." Vivian didn't know how to respond to an 8-year-old who had just said the most reasonable thing anyone had said to her in 3 weeks. Julian set his terms without negotiation or preamble. He would take the car. He needed 7 days. Vivian was not to enter the garage while work was in progress. No technical questions until he was ready to answer them. If she wanted to be present on the property during working hours, she was welcome to sit outside. He gestured toward the folding chair the boy had vacated. Vivian looked at the chair. It was the kind of furniture that had been repaired more than once by someone who valued it. She looked back at Julian. "What's your rate?" "We'll discuss that after I know what's actually wrong," he said. He picked up a rag from the workbench and turned back to the van on the lift. The conversation was over. Vivian stood in the gravel lot for a moment with no useful direction available to her. She hadn't sat outside a garage on a folding chair waiting on someone else's schedule since she was a teenager, spending summer afternoons waiting for her father to finish work so they could drive home together. She had a feeling she was about to do it for an entire week, and she had no framework for that, no template from any of the years she'd spent building a world where she was always the one being waited for. On the first day, Julian removed the access panels and pulled the wiring harness diagram without a word in Vivian's direction. She arrived at 7 in the morning and sat in the folding chair just outside the bay door with a coffee she'd bought from a gas station 3 miles away, because there was nowhere between her hotel and Foundry Row open at that hour with any business calling itself a coffee establishment. The boy, whose name was Mateo, arrived at 8:15, backpack on, game console tucked under one arm, and set a second gas station cup beside Vivian's chair without a word, then walked inside to say goodbye to his father before school. Vivian looked at the cup for a moment. Then she picked it up. On the second day, she began to listen, not to anything she could fully interpret. Julian worked mostly in silence, and when he did speak, it was in fragments, low and technical, directed at the machine rather than any person present. But twice in the afternoon, she heard him shift into Spanish, not conversational Spanish, but the compressed, precise language of someone working through a calculation out loud, someone for whom the mother tongue of the problem was more efficient than anything else. She called Farah from the parking lot and asked if the firm had anyone on retainer who spoke Spanish well enough to translate technical speech. Farah told her she'd find someone. On the third day, Julian came to the bay door at 2:30 and stood there long enough that Vivian looked up from the documents she'd been reviewing on her phone. "None of them were completely wrong," he said. A pause. "None of them were completely right, either." He returned to the garage before she could ask what he meant. She sat with the sentence the rest of the afternoon, turning it over, unable to place it. It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't a verdict. It was the kind of statement that contained an answer she didn't yet have the surrounding context to understand. On the fourth day, Mateo sat in the chair beside her after school and asked, with the directness that belongs exclusively to children and very old people, whether Vivian had any kids. She said no. Mateo considered this with the mild, unencumbered attention children give to facts that interest them. "My dad says people without kids worry more," he said. "Because there's nobody else to think about besides yourself." Vivian lowered her phone and looked at the boy. He was already back to his game console. She didn't respond, because she wasn't sure the observation required one, and also because she suspected it was accurate in a way she'd never had occasion to consider before. On the fifth day, Farah sent a 2-paragraph summary of a phone call she'd managed to partially document through means she declined to fully explain. Julian had called a number in Coventry at 11 in the evening. The contact had been provisionally identified as a former colleague from Holloway Bexley who'd worked in the same electronics division during the same period as Julian. The call lasted 38 minutes. Farah's translated summary of the key exchange. Julian had been asking the contact to confirm a specific firmware behavior from a component supplier used during a particular production run. The contact had confirmed it. Julian had said, in Spanish, "That's it." Then the call ended. Vivian read Farah's summary 3 times and didn't send a reply. She sat with it the way she'd been sitting with everything that week, aware that something was being assembled in the garage on the other side of the wall, unable to see it, unwilling to stop waiting for it. On the sixth day, she drove to the garage and found a handwritten note taped to the gate. "Don't come today." She sat in her rental car on the side of Foundry Row for an hour and 40 minutes, watching a pair of crows negotiate a stretch of fence with increasing intensity, before accepting she wasn't going to be able to make herself leave. She stayed another 40 minutes. Then she drove back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed in her suit, shoes still on, and let a call from Okafor's assistant go to voicemail at 6:15 in the evening. She called back at 7 and told the assistant the car would be ready. She said it with the certainty she'd trained into her voice over 15 years of leadership. She was not certain. She was, for the first time in a very long time, operating on something closer to faith than evidence, and she didn't have a name for what that felt like. Only the awareness that it was unfamiliar and that she hadn't retreated from it. On the seventh day, she arrived at 5:45 in the morning and sat in the chair in the dark. The streetlight at the near end of Foundry Row made a pale circle in the gravel. When Julian came out of the garage at 6, he didn't appear surprised to find her already there. He looked at her in the gray early light, considered something briefly, and said, "Come inside." The Bentley was on the lift, its underside fully exposed. An access panel behind the front wheel arch opened in a way Vivian had never seen outside a manufacturer's technical manual. The interior of the electronics bay was illuminated by two work lights positioned with the careful logic of a surgical suite, and she could see the wiring harness and the control module and the connector housings with a clinical clarity that made the machine look less like a car component and more like something that had been persuaded to give up its secrets. Julian stood beside the vehicle and spoke without looking at her, the way people speak when they're accustomed to explaining things to colleagues rather than audiences. The control module, he told her, was mechanically and electrically sound. Every internal circuit was within specification. The processor showed no fault, no thermal damage, no evidence of the catastrophic failure the first report had described. Vivian didn't say anything. She was listening with a particular quality of attention that comes when someone is carefully dismantling a structure you've spent 3 weeks building and believing in. What had actually happened, Julian continued, was a fault in the wiring harness that fed the new satellite communication unit. A splice made during the installation 5 weeks earlier, tucked against a bracket where it rubbed, over time, against a sharp edge of sheet metal. The insulation had worn through just enough to create an intermittent short, one that only closed the circuit under specific conditions: sustained acceleration, a certain temperature range, a certain vibration frequency. When it closed, it sent a corrupted signal into the same data line the engine control module used for its core operating instructions. The module, receiving nonsense where it expected valid data, had done exactly what it was designed to do: shut everything down rather than risk operating on bad information. The engine hadn't failed. It had been told, falsely, that something catastrophic was happening, and it had believed the lie completely. The reason no one had found this, he explained, wasn't a failure of intelligence or effort, but of specificity. The fault lived entirely outside the engine and its control unit, in an aftermarket wiring harness that none of the 5 specialists had thought to trace back that far, because every diagnostic tool connected to the car read the same corrupted signal and interpreted it as exactly what it most closely resembled: total module failure. No one had gone looking for a cause behind the effect, because the effect was so absolute it appeared to be self-explanatory. The knowledge that this kind of installation fault could masquerade as core module failure existed almost nowhere. Julian had encountered something structurally similar exactly once, years earlier, chasing an intermittent fault on a factory test mule, and had filed the pattern away in the part of his memory reserved for things unlikely to matter again. 2 nights ago, running his hands along every harness in the car by feel rather than by scanner, he'd found the worn insulation by touch before he found it by sight. "What is the total?" Vivian asked. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, as though the room had changed the size of the space available for it. $610, Julian told her. The harness repair, a protective sleeve, and 8 hours of tracing every connector in the car by hand to make sure there wasn't a second one waiting. He had documented every step. She didn't react the way she might have expected. There was no relief, not immediately. What came first was a slow, settling reckoning with how close she'd come to authorizing $243,000 of work on a component that had never been broken. Not because she'd been careless or credulous, but because she'd asked credentialed people the wrong question and accepted their answers as the available truth. She had asked what was wrong with the module. The right question had been what was wrong with the car. Julian had asked the right question before touching a single part of either one. She turned from the vehicle and looked at the wall of the garage, truly looked at it for the first time in 7 days, and saw the photograph. Julian at perhaps 26, in the dark coveralls of the Halloway Bexley Electronics team, standing in a workshop that looked like something between a laboratory and a cathedral of precision. Beside him, a woman with her head tipped easily toward his shoulder, a smile that looked like it had always lived in her face and always would, and cradled in Julian's arms, a bundle so new to the world that the world hadn't yet fully registered it. Scrawled in marker at the lower corner, Mateo, Day 1. Vivian looked at the photograph a long moment. Then she turned back to Julian. He was wiping his hands on a rag with the same unhurried motion she'd watched him perform 100 times over the past 7 days. And he wasn't looking at her, because he didn't need to see her face to know what she was working out. She sat down in Mateo's chair, which Julian had at some point moved inside the bay, and asked him something she hadn't planned to ask. "Why did you leave Coventry?" He folded the rag and set it on the bench. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might choose not to answer. Then he said, "My wife passed when Mateo was 14 months old. Aneurysm. No warning, nothing before it." A pause. "I couldn't be in England and be a father at the same time. My uncle had left me this. So I came back." He gestured at the garage, a motion that was neither dismissive nor proud, simply accurate. The gesture of a man indicating something that was simply and completely true. "I chose Mateo." Vivian asked if he ever regretted the choice. He thought about that with the seriousness he brought to mechanical problems, not the performance of consideration, but the actual thing. "Every day," he said, "and not once." Vivian sat with that answer a moment. It was the kind of thing that sounds like a contradiction until suddenly it doesn't, until you understand that both halves are simultaneously true, and the only dishonest response would be to choose one over the other. Then she laid it out plainly, without dressing it up. A position, Director of Technical Operations for Cole Aerowright's Private Collection Division, complete authority over service and engineering for the fleet, a salary she named without hesitation, because hesitating over a number she'd already calculated would have been its own kind of insult. Equity participation, a proper facility with a team he'd build himself, access to manufacturer relationships and technical archives that Foundry Row had no path to. The kind of platform that would let him work on problems truly worthy of what he knew. Julian listened to all of it. He let the offer sit in the air between them long enough that Vivian could feel the weight of it. Then he shook his head once, without theater or apology. "Mateo's school is 4 blocks from here," he said. "I bring him lunch on Wednesdays. His teacher lets me eat with the class because he asked and she said yes." He looked at Vivian directly. "There's no salary that replaces that." Vivian found she couldn't argue with this, which was unusual for her. She had arguments for most things. She asked instead, "Then what can I do for you?" And she meant it as the genuine question, not a negotiating position, not a social courtesy, but the honest inquiry of someone who had just watched a man outperform every resource available to her, and who wanted to understand what the correct reciprocation looked like. Julian thought about it in the same unhurried way he thought about everything. "If you ever have a client with a car nobody can figure out," he said, "you know where I am. That's enough." Vivian nodded. She placed her business card on the bench beside the folded rag. "If you ever change your mind," she said, and left the sentence unfinished, because finishing it would have implied she expected him to, and she'd already understood that she didn't. Mateo arrived home from school while Vivian was still in the garage. The boy dropped his backpack in its habitual spot by the door with the authority of someone who'd done it in exactly that location for years, walked directly to the Bentley, and placed both palms flat on the hood. He stood there a moment, head slightly tilted, as though listening for something only he knew to listen for. Then he turned to his father. "Dad, is it better?" "It's better," Julian said. Mateo nodded once, with the placid certainty of someone confirming a fact that was always going to be true, retrieved his backpack, and went to find a snack. Vivian drove away from Foundry Row an hour later. She found, as she turned onto the main road and the gate disappeared from her mirrors, that the week had a quality she hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely name. Not simply the resolution of the problem, but something in the particular texture of how it had been resolved. She had sat in a folding chair outside a garage for 7 days and had been given almost nothing in the way of reassurance or information, and she had stayed. She had stayed because something in the economy of Julian Reyes, the total absence of performance, the complete refusal to manage her expectations or ornament his confidence, had communicated, without ever stating it, that the work was being done correctly. She hadn't known before this week that she was capable of trusting something that quiet. Desmond Okafor arrived on Friday afternoon as scheduled, with the punctual, unannounced quality he brought to everything. He drove the Bentley for 18 minutes along the route Vivian had mapped, the same coast road where the engine had cut 3 weeks earlier, plus a return loop, including a stretch of hard acceleration that would tax the electronics precisely where the original failure had occurred. The car ran clean through every gear. The cabin was as quiet as the day it had left the factory. Okafor parked in front of the coal building, sat a moment after the engine went quiet, then stepped out and handed Vivian the key. "Who worked on it?" he asked. "An engineer I trust." "From your network?" "No." Okafor turned the key over in his hand once, the slow, deliberate motion of someone thinking about something other than the key. He was a man who had spent 60 years reading other people, and he was reading Vivian now. He found something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not the controlled confidence she wore like a second architecture, but something underneath it that had been rearranged, something that had the look of a thing recently and genuinely learned. He was experienced enough to know that certain problems, when they resolve in a particular way, don't simply end. They alter the person they happen to. He'd seen that in business, and in the parts of life that didn't carry business names. He didn't ask what had changed. He asked the cost. Vivian looked at him steadily. $610. Okafor was quiet a long moment. He didn't express surprise. He'd lived long enough to know that the most expensive answer and the correct answer rarely shared a building. "The best ones," he said, almost to himself, "are never where you expect to look." He extended his hand. They shook. He told her he'd be in touch the following week about the partnership renewal, and his tone carried the quiet warmth of something already decided before he'd gotten into the car. That evening, Vivian drove west on her own time, in the rental car she'd been using for 3 weeks and had largely stopped registering as unfamiliar. She turned onto Foundry Row as the light went amber, the particular quality of evening light that makes even tired streets look briefly significant. The gate of Reyes Auto was closed and locked for the night, and from the road she could see, through the side window of the small attached house, a square of warm yellow light, and within it 2 silhouettes, one large, one small, seated together at what appeared to be a dinner table. The small one was doing most of the talking. The large one was listening with complete, undivided attention, the way a person listens when there's nowhere else they'd rather be and nothing they consider more important than the voice in front of them. Vivian didn't stop the car. She drove back the way she'd come and didn't turn on the radio. She thought, without sentimentality but with a particular precision that was her best mode of thought, about what the week had actually demonstrated. Not about Julian Reyes specifically, though she'd think about him often in the months that followed, the way you think about things that correct something fundamental in you. But about the habit, deeply worn into years of practiced certainty, of arriving at conclusions before the evidence was complete, of trusting institutions because they were large and credentialed and expensive, and treating those qualities as a reliable proxy for being right, of confusing the confidence of experts with the accuracy of their expertise. 2 things she had always known were not the same, and had somehow, without noticing, begun to treat as though they were. She had nearly spent $243,000 replacing a component that a $600 wiring fault had been falsely accusing. She had been corrected by a man who earned his living in a 2-bay garage on a road most of her colleagues had never thought to find, who had carried a small pattern in his memory for years until the morning it became the only thing that mattered, and who had turned down everything she could offer him, because Wednesday lunches with his son were not an item on any salary schedule she had the authority to match. She added his number to her phone under a new contact entry, Julian Reyes, Reyes Auto, Foundry Row. Below the number, She typed 4 words and saved it without revision. Do not call late. Then she drove back to the hotel, ordered dinner for the first time in 3 weeks without simultaneously reviewing documents, and ate it in the kind of quiet she hadn't known she'd been missing. End.